6. Unfathomed. Luther couldn't correlate what he saw with daytime, but Aram assured him it was. Bright as the sky was, there was no solar warmth to it, no reassuring charge to the air which invigorated and rejuvenated and healed. In fact, the world grew colder once they'd sped out from beneath the clouds, and donned dry gear in their seats to fight off the chill of the lingering damp they'd dragged in from the river. The sky was a panoply of streaked, aging ivory and milky white. This was drilled through with what Luther couldn't help but think of as holes, blacker than black flecks against the pale canvas which radiated streaks of liquescent shadow into the blank heavens. They were arranged like stars, these dark holes in the sky, and among them soared a black mass far larger than any other, a cruel parody of the sun, as Luther saw it, which glared down upon the malformed landscape like an empty and covetous eye. That landscape was a horror in itself, for the reddish hue which had seeped into the foliage beneath the clouds seemed almost to pain the beholder here. The plants were bloated with it, fat and slow to bend in the low wind which haunted the hills. The trunks and limbs of the trees were a bone white, and seemed run through with veins of black that bulged and twitched in the light of the sunless sky. The drainage ditches along the road and the one-time cattle ponds which dotted the distant landscape were oil slicks upon a Martian surface of blood-tinted grasses, and they did not stand empty beneath the cold sky. There were beasts in the derelict pastures and flooded lowlands between Louisville and Lexington. The lowlands of Kentucky had been stripped clean of horses and cows, and in their place, many-legged furry grazers bumbled through the tall grasses and chewed over the red growth. They were woolen and lumbering, far larger than any buffalo or steer. Yet their legs seemed segmented beneath their sheeting hair, and their mouths were forests of blunt mandibles which made Luther think of caterpillars or ants. They strode the plains and valleys in vast herds, and though they lazily hoisted their heads to watch the group's car roll past through bulbous clusters of mirrored eyes, they did not pursue. Even more uncanny were the equine-looking creatures which bedded down in the shadows of many old barns upon the hills. They stood tall on limbs which seemed far too long, legs like bony spines which seemed to wobble like stilts when the beasts walked, elongated necks which bulged with each mouthful allowed skeletal heads wreathed in coarse black hair to pluck leaves from the top of altered trees. The eldest were the size of giraffes. As huge as they were, Luther could not help but believe they had once been horses, and yet every ounce of grace and poise had been stripped from them. Now they seemed like undead wraiths haunting the edges of fields in the meadows of reddish woodland. Slender, six-hooved creatures with the sleek builds of large tigers sported thick manes of brown fur. Their heads were antlered and cervid, like the largest buck or bull moose in saner parts of the world, and yet their fearsome jaws were more like the broad and jagged teeth of crocodiles. These hunted the grazers in packs, and occasionally were seen to scamper across the roadway before the car in pursuit of prey. As with the herbivores they slew, these misshapen predators seemed too wrapped up in their lounging and chasing to pursue the alien trespassers in this cruel expanse of dreamscape. Mighty flocks of something akin to dragonflies roamed the skies, and several of their larger specimens, perhaps the length of a man, made vain attempts to strafe the car as it passed through their silent dominion. Loud as these attempts to snatch away the car were, they didn't slow the group's progress, and the overgrown bugs would return to harassing the native fauna of the dreamer's strange new world. Their buzzing hordes came and went, and the creatures of the ground made for the cover of trees and ruined buildings when they darkened the pale canvas overhead. Even more tension was breathed into the icy atmosphere by Sias when he joked that, as he put it, the enemy was growing desperate. Aram agreed, saying that the whispers had grown particularly frequent. He said he was thankful the sleeping god wasn't entirely awake, for he wasn't sure he could hold up in the face of a real onslaught from the thing. When he asked Surreal whether he'd been bothered by these whispers, Surreal flatly dismissed them as annoyances. Luther, seemingly the only one in the vehicle put on edge by this conversation, was the sole rider who wasn't consulted, and he was happy for it. All this severely darkened Luther's thoughts. Surreal seemed nearly as nervous as he, and asked several times whether they should wait until true night fell over the dreamscape before continuing on. Luther felt naked and exposed in the loud car rolling through so placid and stealthy a landscape, and he sensed Surreal felt that tension just as keenly as he did. Perhaps these whispers of the enemy also played a role. Aram wouldn't have it, though, for the longer they waited, the more danger would slip back from the front lines of the apocalyptic struggle out west to find them in the hinterlands of the dreamer. Aram had already underestimated the pace of expansion once, and he was not prepared to allow himself the same mistake again. They were to go straight to the mouth and allow nothing to slow their progress. As time marched on and the outskirts of Lexington neared, though, Luther came to believe Surreal was nervous for a different reason. The big man beside him didn't look out the windows or flinch at the strafing insects which taunted the car now and again. He didn't linger on the weak old corpses left over from the civilization which had died here, being devoured by the oblong hordes of the dreamer's paradise in the shadows of the ruins they passed by. Rather, Surreal seemed to be mouthing strange words to himself, building himself up for some unknown struggle he was uncertain could be won. Luther almost asked him about it, but with the steely forms of Aram and Sias so silent up front, he didn't dare break the quiet with his probing, and kept his own worries locked away unspoken inside his skull. Lexington itself had been leveled. Luther was unfamiliar with the little city, and yet even without a knowledge of what it had looked like prior to the fall, its outskirts looked bombed out and blasted. Though the walls were not twisted by bombs, and the husks of strip malls and neighborhoods weren't pockmarked with the scars of gunfire, fires from the destroyed industrial parks and factories had swept the outskirts and left them blackened with ash. In the skeletal remains of these structures, fleshy red vines and fungal blooms clung to walls like scuttling insects, and the yawning roofs vomited gnarled albino trees which grew skyward at an impossible pace. Overturned cars and the shattered glass of storefronts and windshields made the roads an obstacle course through which they had to weave and wind, and yet there were no corpses. Luther wondered just how thorough the gnawing hordes of the dreamer were, how long it took them to strip clean the cities they razed and scamper west into the distance, in search of the next conquest and the feasts which followed. The rolling hills and open greenery which had once surrounded the city were now run through with a fetid crimson, and the snapped remnants of bones from men, dogs, and even horses stood white against the wards and pasturage of stately southern homes. These were singular relics, though, for lonely skulls and femurs and ribs lay isolated from the rest of the bones which had accompanied them in life, forgotten in the frenzied rush of some devourer to slip off in search of another glut. As they passed the sprawling corpse of a car dealership pushing east out of town, a black mass rose up to look upon them from the shorn roof of the building. Luther had thought it was piled earth or a massive, stories-high mound of ash right up until it moved. It was hunched, with two tapering arms and a misshapen head, almost human in shape, just like many of the distant giants Luther had glimpsed in silhouette during their first night in the car. In the red and white haze of the cold daylight which reigned here, the Stygian dark of its shimmering skin seemed to waver and shift like heat haze against the shine. Sheets of reddish moss hung like streamers from a forest of dagger-sharp spines and horns which burst from its body, Set in a skull bleak as the black holes in the waxen sky overhead, its many eyes had the filmy, yellowish shade of spoiled milk. It watched them with slothful disinterest as they went along their way, and sank back down into a slouched ball in the dealership's innards after they'd gotten a few 100 yards down the road. This was just one among many such surreal encounters they slid past due to the gluttonous apathy of the things which lulled in the wreckage about the roads. Countless glistening, pulsating pupae had been gestating in the abandoned cars along I-64 East, and the wet folds of these oversized cocoons spilled from cracked windows and open sunroofs like biscuit dough, rupturing a can. A hairy, winged creature so large its silhouette blotted out the light upon the road passed over several times, observing them, only to bank languidly off towards the west, as if deciding the outsiders weren't worth its trouble. The shade of an overpass along the interstate played host to a sleeping group of 24 of the same misshapen hunters they'd seen fighting and killing along the outskirts of the storm. The hunters slumbered so deeply that the passing of the car only woke a couple, and they didn't bother to pursue. Luther knew little about what the Kentucky hill country had looked like prior to this, but he imagined it had been similar to pasturage and young forest land in lower Illinois and Missouri. Seeing the blackberry briars that lined the forests along the roadside swell thick as a human arm, and witnessing the branches of ancient oaks along pasture fences wave and buckle like upturned spiders trying to right themselves, he couldn't help but imagine what was happening in the lands they'd left behind them. The black blood which fell in that constant rain had bled an unnatural life into everything which consumed it, from the smallest blades of grass to the ornery bulls which fed upon them. How far had the change gone, and how fast did it take hold? How many days had this artificial sky shone that cruel, Arctic light onto these twisted remnants of a landscape which had once been verdant with wholesome life? The deadlands grew yet more lively as the car chewed through the miles, making the questions hang all the heavier upon Luther's thoughts. By the time they'd passed the embers which had once been the suburban city of Winchester, the pillared porches of plantation-style homes had been wholly consumed by red growth, and the signs of the human inhabitants which had been so recently driven from the land became all but invisible. The road grew rougher as the flora grew thicker, and as they turned southeast onto the mountain parkway at Aram's eager direction, Luther couldn't shake the feeling they were flinging themselves off a cliff. More so than ever before, he felt they were wholly alone, swallowed up by the barbarian nothingness which reigned in the lands of the dreamer. No straggling survivors, helpful or otherwise, would stumble upon them here, he thought. Nor would some military breakthrough see planes rupture the awful alien skyscape to set fire to the ugly manse of foreign foliage upon the earth. This was a conquered land, and he couldn't help but think no amount of purging, burning, or replanting could ever fully cure it of the sickness which had taken hold here. For Luther, this was a frightening glimpse into the yawning mouth of the unknown. For Aram and Sias up front, it seemed almost to breathe new life into them. They broke their silence and murmured about the prospect for survival in the gamble they were taking as each mangled mile marker sped by, about how brilliantly terrible and novel the sights and metallic smells of this new world were. For them, they felt like explorers freshly crashed upon a distant world, thrilled by each and every new sensation. Luther, who had always felt left out within their company, still felt like a stowaway whose accidental presence only cruel happenstance could explain. Surreal was still sullen, though. His eyes blazed at the sights which welled up and dominated the landscape around them, but he did not speak, and he certainly didn't crane his head to drink in every detail. In fact, Luther had grown fairly certain Surreal was staring at Sias in the seat before him, eyes drilling into the back of the stout man's shaven head as he drove them along. What this meant, he didn't know, but he wouldn't have to brood over it for long. 40 minutes they spent on the mountain parkway, watching sheer rock faces and tight valley corridors replace the open hills of the lowlands. The thick woods here made the Amazon look tame, for the confusing reddish maze and its bony clusters of pallid trunks were painful to look upon. Even the stone had been altered, for the clean, light cliffs and boulders which once would have decorated the mountain walls were shot through with fleshy vines, or veins, vile as the thought was to Luther, of deepest black and ivory, which pulsed and shimmered with an unnatural vibrance. The road here was all but clear, with only a few tattered vehicles to slow them, and the floodwaters having long ago subsided down the creek bottoms which littered the Appalachian foothills. Progress was good, but signs of life grew more and more troublesome as the hills around them pressed in closer and closer. Though occasional movement haunted the trees, the real life was in the air, for the forested region resounded with a low rumble which it took Luther some time to realize was the rhythmic thumping of drums. Even through the windows, over the engine of the car, the chanting which accompanied it could be grasped at, the syllables low and growled, almost vibrating the chest like the bass rumble of a massive speaker. Countless voices were imprisoned in that tonal jumble. Sias rolled down his window to better listen to the sounds drifting down from the windless mountain tops, and the symphony was almost mechanical, like an audio sample forced through one too many filters. Luther strained to see any sign of the masses who must be singing up there as they wound along riversides, but the notorious low-slung mountains of Appalachia were even more thick with trees now than they'd ever been, and the ancient mountaintops were not about to surrender their secrets to him. They turned off at a barely legible, vine-buried sign for a place called Campton. The town had been little, Luther guessed, mostly an outpost for tourists visiting the nearby geological sites in the gorge which had been so heavily advertised along the parkway. It was impossible to tell, though, for like a jungle creeping back in on a derelict farm, the whole place had been devoured totally by the alien growth which had dominated the mountains. The lone gas station near the exit was where they stopped, but it was only recognizable as a gas station because of the shape of the awning over the place where the pumps had once been. Every inch of the building was blanketed by needle-leaf creepers which grew thick as kudzu, and the lot was fast becoming a scarlet meadow. They rolled to a halt before the entrance, and Aram led them in, unloading what supplies remained from the car. Everything feasible was stuffed into packs while Sias took a machete to the growth which blocked the shattered station doors. Not a word was spoken. With the engine silenced, the chanting and drumming and animalistic bleating on the mountaintops was all but deafening. Cheap as the protection of the gas station shell was, Luther desperately wanted to get in there, to be out of sight of the tree line, whose shadows he found himself glancing for again and again as they offloaded. Only when they'd slid into the looted, barren innards of the station and moved into the back did Luther feel slightly secure, and even then, he found it hard to believe their position wasn't known by every woodland thing within a mile of Campton's ruins. Luther was too caught up in worry over the things outside to realize the others were etching designs with knives into the drywall at the rear of the building until they'd already finished. Aram worked with practiced hands, and the designs, strange and illegible as they were to Luther, seemed graceful, despite the method. They were intermittently curving and angular, a confusing tangle of interlocking sigils and lines which formed a dark circle amidst the murky white of the wall. The lights were off, of course, and the low light trickling in past the foliage along the storefront steeped the scene in dirty shadows, lending the whole display a sinister air. "It could still be me, you know," Aram said as he stood to inspect his own work. "I would do it gladly." "You were needed to lead," Sias replied with a brisk shake of his head. "I don't know any more than you about what we'll find near the mouth," Aram told him. "You're just as capable as I am of completing the last leg of the journey." Sias shook his head. There had been a hollow sadness in Aram's words, the first time Luther had ever heard such an emotion color his brother's speech. Surreal stood numb and vacant to the side, eyes boring fruitlessly into the carving upon the wall as if searching for escape. Aram maintained eye contact with Sias for a while, nodding to himself. A smile, pained but genuine, broke his dour features. "You've always been perfectly aware what it was all about," Aram told him. "Always focused on the struggle and never the trappings. Most of the others that hear the mountain's call have to be coached to realize all the orgiastic ritual and excess in the induction cults is just set dressing. Degeneracy to drive out those with morals too civilized to fit into the order. Never you, though." Sias let a slight grin creep into his own features, but the quiet man seemed at a loss for what to say. "You know, I read a passage from a book once during a misguided plumbing of social media that someone had reposted," Aram said. "It began with a Thoreau quote about the mass of men living lives of quiet desperation. I've always liked Thoreau, even if he is a bit soft at times. So I read the commentary that had been laid out to accompany it, and I found I quite liked that, too." Aram paced as he talked, and Luther knew he was about to quote from memory. If there was such a thing as eidetic photographic recall, Luther knew enough from years of childhood company that Aram was one who possessed it. How many men stand on a balcony and wonder what happened? He wanted adventure and got 2 weeks vacation. He wanted a mission and got a lawn that needed mowing. He wanted purpose and got a cubicle. He wanted a mighty steed and got a minivan. He wanted a castle and got a mortgage. He wanted a battle to fight, and he got televised sports instead. Aram finished with a smile that would have spoken to humor in any situation which wasn't so dire. Even Luther, blind to what exactly was about to happen, understood the gravity of it. As it was, the smile seemed sorrowful. "I read that and felt I needed to know who wrote those words. I needed to seek out whatever cure he was preaching to the pointless monotony of daily life," Aram said with a snort. "Do you know what I found?" Sias, grinning more broadly now, said, "I've got a few minutes, brother. Lay it on me." "It was from a fucking dating guru's self-insert interview novel," Aram laughed. "All of that astute diagnosis just for the author to suggest that a young man who yearns for conquest should just get more pussy." Sias joined Aram in his laugh. Even Surreal brightened a bit at that. "The guy looked like a yoga instructor as well," Aram went on. "Never had a tooth knocked loose or heard shots fired in anger. Never watched a brother bleed his last or walked the ruins of a city he conquered. And yet, fat on the nectar of wine and women, he figured he'd weigh in and write a thesis on what it means to be a man." The laughter died, and Aram ceased his pacing. Aram was dead serious now, and Sias seemed to hang on the words he spoke, as did all of the men present in the room. "You never had that problem, Sias. I've known you for years, and for you the draw of the call of the mountain has always been the struggle. It isn't the pomp and ceremony and company. It isn't the hallucinogenic trips or the flirtation with danger or the excitement of working outside the bounds of the law. It's not even the cause, though the cause is a noble one. It's always been the challenge for you, and you've never once backed down from that challenge." "What can I say?" Sias said after a long exhale. "Dad raised me right." Surreal chuckled at that, despite the tension. "You're a good man," Aram told him. "Strong. In a better, wilder age, you'd have been a bandit lord burning castles or a raider spilling in from the wilds. You should have been with us in the end. It's good enough for me that I'll get you to the end, even if I don't make the end of the road myself," Sias said. Morgan and Traven would have said the same thing. "Now have the kid do the deed. We don't know how much time we've got." Aram nodded. He dipped a hand into his bag and produced a long, remarkably thin knife. almost an oversized needle. It glistened so sharply Luther couldn't help but believe that it, like their ammunition, was a thing forged of pure silver. He placed the thing in Soraya's shaking hand, then motioned for the big man to wait as he walked over to Luther. "The mountains are crawling with the enemy," he explained, fishing for something else in his bag as he spoke. "There are too few of us to fight our way to the mouth. We're going to walk through the world beyond the veil, the world of the mountain. We'll re-emerge onto this plain right at the edge of the Dreamer's Maw, and from there we'll be descending into it." Aram produced a small iron cross on a dull chain of equally heavy iron and hung it around Luther's neck. "The world beyond the veil is almost as hostile as the Deadlands," Aram told him. "But Soraya is somehow in sync with that world, and though we don't know exactly why, the things in it are pliable around him. Even if we didn't have Soraya, it's still the better option compared to climbing the slopes here." Aram planted a finger on the cross upon Luther's chest as he said, "The things beyond the veil are like the Fae of old. Perhaps they are the Fae of old. For us, the distinction's unimportant. Whatever the case, they, like the Fae, aren't fond of iron. If you are separated from us, then this might deter anything there from taking you." Aram then returned to Soraya, grasping the man by the shoulders and reminding him they all had roles to fill. Much as Soraya seemed to grasp that, it didn't seem to shore up his nerves. The gesture was given, and the big man went forward to meet Sias along the wall. Sias stood against the pattern Aram had carved there, and the center of his back was pressed to the circle. Sias slid off his shirt, and Soraya lined up the needle-like knife he held, ensuring he'd slip past any ribs and directly into the heart. He stood still a long moment, hand gripped tight against the handle to ward off the jitters. "You'll kill it for me, won't you?" Sias asked the question of Soraya. The big man hesitated a moment, seeming lost for words, before managing a surprisingly forceful yes. Only when Sias ordered him to did Soraya finally make the thrust. The needle struck true, and for a moment Sias was pinned to the drywall behind him by the blade. His breath left him almost immediately, and he was gone within seconds. Once the dead weight of the sturdy man fell upon the knife, it ripped free of the wall, and Soraya eased the man to the floor, where he bled his last onto the dirty tile. Though Luther had fully realized what was about to happen during Aram's reminiscence with Sias, that realization didn't steal any of the shock from him when it happened. Even more startling was Aram making for the tiny, reddish hole left by the piercing knife in the wall. The savage music which haunted the hills was swelling now, and though Luther's racing thoughts didn't quantify it at the time, the voices in the chants were drawing nearer. Aram ripped at the drywall with his fingers, and the stuff sloughed away like dead skin. The space beyond that wall was not the open air outside or some back room in the station, but something else entirely. The circle sigil soon resembled a ragged mirror, and yet, hazy and warbled as it was, the reflection on the other side was no reflection at all, not as Luther understood it. Soraya, still catching his breath and throwing guilty glances at the comrade he'd stricken down, had to be ushered in first by Aram. Once he'd crawled through the gap into that world beyond the veil, as Aram had put it, it was Luther's turn to go. "It should be dark and dead," Aram told him. "We can afford to use the lights. We may have to. Just stick close to Soraya and keep quiet, in case there's still fighting going on. I'll be right behind you." With a last, shaken look at the silent corpse upon the floor, Luther crawled through the little gap in the wall like a man straddling a waist-high fence, cautious not to disturb the blood which pooled beneath the portal.